Jesus presented in his earthly ministry. And then I'll let you be the judge as you're listening to his explanation of reality and various questions that you and I have in our minds, and then you can be the judge whether indeed his answers were thoroughly unique. And I believe they are. My book that I wrote last year on Jesus talking to Gautama Buddha, it's interesting that the letters we are getting from Buddhist countries, from Thailand, from Malaysia, from Taiwan, from Korea, where Buddhists themselves are writing and acknowledging that they are seeing the very great differences in the teaching, and those differences are there. People will often try to make some comment like this in a very ironic intent, of course, that all religions are fundamentally the same, they are only superficially different. May I suggest to you that they're actually fundamentally different. At best, they may be superficially similar. The fundamental claims are diametrically opposite among some of the major religions of the world. So with that, as some introductory comments, let me begin on a personal note. I was born and raised in India. India is a land of many, many religions. Hinduism is the predominant religion in India. Then there's Islam, there's Sikhism, there's Buddhism, there's Jainism, Baha'ism. Christianity forms a very small minority, even though the Apostle Thomas reputedly went to India to take the gospel in that very first generation after the encounter with Christ. And it was at the age of 17, while I was on a bed of suicide, that I first encountered the message of Jesus Christ and took seriously the claims that were given in the New Testament. That was a very trying and a very difficult stage in my life, as personal as it is and as difficult as it is for me to talk about it. I think it is important that you know that it was in a context such as that. If any one of you is here from India, you'll know I'm not overstating the fact, but the pressure to perform and do well in the academy is very intense in that country, as it is in many parts of Asia. And somehow I wasn't delivering what it was going to take, with a father that was intensely displeased with my own indisciplines and so on. The tension built within my own life, and I found myself in a hospital room with a New Testament handed to me. A short while before that, I was sitting in the living room of our home in New Delhi. My dad was a very highly placed officer in the Indian government, quite well recognized. In fact, when he emigrated to Canada, there was a little article in the newspaper about his contribution to the Indian government and so on. Quite a prominent man. But I remember sitting in the living room listening to this song, coming from what was called Ceylon at that time, now Sri Lanka. There was a weekly radio program, and there was a song coming forth in English, but it had the backdrop of an Eastern chant. And the narrator of that song was a man by the name of Ed Ames. And this is the way it went. From the canyons of the mind, we wander on and stumble blind, wade through the often tangled maze of starless nights and sunless days, hoping for some kind of clue, a road to lead us to the truth. But who will answer? As side by side two people stand, together vowing hand in hand that love's embedded in their hearts, but soon an empty feeling starts to overwhelm their hollow lives, and if they ask the hows and whys, who will answer? As far upon a distant hill, a young man's lying very still. His arms will never hold his child, because a bullet running wild has struck him down, and now he cries, my God, oh why, and who will answer? As 'neath the spreading mushroom tree, the world revolves with apathy, while overhead a row of specks roars on, drowned out by discotheques. And if the secret button's pressed because one man has been outguessed, who will answer? And then the chorus went this way. If the soul is darkened by a fear it cannot name, if the mind is baffled when the rules don't fit the game, who will answer, who will answer, who will answer? But with all of those verses, as much as I could identify with them and think of broken marriages and broken dreams and the emptiness, think of somebody being killed in a random shot who will not be there to father his child and so on, the verse that really stood out was the one that went this way. Is our hope in walnut shells, worn round the neck with temple bells, or deep within some cloistered walls where hooded figures pray in shawls, or high upon some dusty shelves, or in the stars or in ourselves? Who will answer? It was a very pertinent question in a land of intensely pluralistic worldviews. And the more I pondered that, the more I began to wonder, is it really possible to wade through all this material and come with some semblance of a satisfactory answer? And I believe the deepest questions of the human heart are reduced ultimately to four: the question of origin, the question of meaning, the question of morality, and the question of destiny. At whatever level you have engaged these questions, to be sure, as a thinking person, you have wrestled with them, and you see the interconnectedness of it. The question of origin, the question of meaning, the question of morality, and the question of destiny. How did I come to be? What is it that binds my various exploits together? How do I determine between right and wrong? And what happens to a human being after he or she dies? Now, I believe, as I'm presenting to you, that Jesus did answer these questions. Some of you may roundly disagree with the way these questions have been answered, but I hope you'll give it a fair hearing. It was the well-known writer W.E.H. Lecky, in his A History of European Morals from Augustus to Charlemagne, who made this comment. And Lecky himself, not necessarily sympathetic as a Christian, but he wrote these words: "The character of Jesus has not only been the highest pattern of virtue, but the strongest incentive in its practice, and has exerted so deep an influence that it may be truly said that the simple record of 3 short years of active life has done more to regenerate and to soften mankind than all the disquisitions of philosophers and all the exhortations of moralists." That's a very, very affirming statement from a secular writer, that in those 3 short years, he became the benchmark of that which was noble and that which was pure. Even Mahatma Gandhi made the comment that there was something so pristine and pure about the life of Christ that set him apart over anyone else. I was interacting with Buddhist scholars last year because I was writing the book, The Lotus and the Cross, and I was astounded at the number of times I would encounter these scholars or academics or whatever who would say to me that in their estimation, there had never been a life more purely lived. And some of those scholars have put those very words in print. Certainly, the life of Jesus Christ is worthy of our honest attention to see what it is he has to say about the existential ways and struggles in which you and I seek to find meaning in life. So the first description I give to you is that Jesus' description itself of the human condition conforms to the reality in which we encounter it. You see, he didn't just talk of human behavior as being good or bad. He categorized it in a very precise and a definite way as one that even at its best would miss the mark, but at its worst was a transgression or a violation of the moral law of God. None of us ever likes the term sin or likes the term evil. But sometimes we stand over against certain behaviors where there is no other word that seems to describe what it is that we have just witnessed. I have been an itinerant person for nearly 30 years. This is my 30th year in this kind of work. And I recall a defining moment for me. And I'd been in many countries where I'd seen sorry sights. I was in Vietnam during the thick of the Vietnam conflict, traveling from military base to military base. Though I was just in my 20s, was working alongside the chaplains all the way to the demilitarized zone. I remember sitting in Quang Tri and watching an amber-colored sky. Many times driving by all kinds of explosions and ambushes on the side of the road. I was in Cambodia just weeks before Cambodia fell. So I'd seen an awful lot of carnage and devastation over many years. But the defining moment for me, I believe, took place as I was standing at what now remains of Auschwitz in Poland. This was long before the Cold War had begun to thaw. I was asked to come and lecture in Warsaw and 1 or 2 other cities. And my host, who was a medical doctor, asked me if I'd like to go and see Auschwitz. I didn't expect to see too much. Years before, I'd been to Buchenwald in East Germany and thought that's about what I was going to see. But as I walked into those rooms, I was not prepared for the horror of what awaited me and what I was going to see of the remnants of all those torture chambers. In one of those rooms, stashed behind glass, was 14,000 pounds of women's hair. Women who were taken into their gas ovens and then scalped, and their hair taken and woven into gunny sacks, and now stacked up behind glass. Tens of thousands of pairs of little children's shoes, tiny little toothbrushes, small travel cases, little pairs of shorts and little girls' dresses. Pictures there of twins standing there stark naked, looking absolutely terrified, having been at the mercy and under the scalpel of Joseph Mengele. I remember as I stood there fighting back the emotion, some teenagers just broke down and wept and left. I was suddenly, as I looked around, I just saw one man standing beside me. And he looked at me and he said, "What kind of work do you do, sir?" I said, "Well, I have to tell you that one of the principal things I do is I'm a minister of the gospel." He said, "Well, then I think you've got an awful lot to think about and explain here, haven't you?" I said, "Yes, sir." I said, "What kind of work do you do?" He said, "I'm a judge I'm a state judge from the state of New York. I'm just visiting here." I said, "You know what? I think both of us have a lot of thinking and explaining to do when you think of the role that judges played in this very event here." And as we stood there, both of us were speechless for some time. We walked into the place where the gas ovens were, and as you entered one of them, the words of Adolf Hitler were scrawled on a piece of paper. "I want to raise a generation of young people, imperious, relentless, and cruel, devoid of a conscience." Suddenly I was looking at evil with a reality that I had never ever seen before. That's why I recall so clearly when Adolf Eichmann was brought to trial, because I have been at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem and seen young people transcribing the hours and hours of the testimony that were given. And it is Hannah Arendt, I think, that wrote the book on the trial of Eichmann. But when Eichmann was arrested in Argentina by a Mossad operation and a drug was injected into him and he was brought back to Jerusalem, over the period of the transfer was a man by the name of Peter Malkin. And Peter Malkin had lost an 8-year-old nephew at the hands of Eichmann. So Malkin wanted to talk to him very much but resisted because it was not his responsibility. But finally he broke down and could not resist anymore. Just before he said goodbye to Eichmann, he sat by his bed. He said, "I have a question for you, sir." He said, "I watched you for many days in your home through some equipment far away, and I would see you getting off that bus as you would come back from working in that Mercedes-Benz factory. I tracked you as you would walk into your home. You'd open the gate, you'd look back to see if anyone was watching. Then I noticed what you did. You'd open your door and a little boy would jump into your arms. Your son, wasn't he?" Eichmann said, "Yes, he is." And he named him. He was about 8 or 10 years old. And he said, "Mr. Eichmann, I have a question for you. You see, I had a nephew about the age of your son, and every time I saw your son, I thought of my nephew. And you mercilessly killed him along with many others. Why did you do that? What's the difference to you between a young lad like that and your very own son?" And Peter Malkin awaited quietly as Eichmann pondered and pondered the question. And then he turned around and looked at Peter Malkin and said, "My son isn't Jewish." At that moment, Malkin had absolutely nothing left to say. He sobbed uncontrollably like a little baby and walked out of the room. He said, "I have no explanation for such hatred, even against a little child. I have no explanation for it." You see, we can ponder and ask ourselves the question, how do we describe such hostility? How do we describe such hatred? We can have all kinds of platitudes and social theories, but listen to what even a psychologist who was hardly a Christian making this comment many years before, Hobart Maurer, who died in 1982 at his own hands, having committed suicide. PhD from Johns Hopkins, 4 years instructor at Yale, 8 years professor at Harvard, 1954 president of the American Psychological Association. In an article in the American Psychologist, here's what Hobart Maurer said: "For several decades, we psychologists have looked upon the whole matter of sin and moral accountability as a great incubus and acclaimed our liberation from it as epoch-making. But at length we have discovered that to be free in this sense, that is to have the excuse of being sick rather than being sinful, is to also court the danger of becoming lost. This danger is, I believe, betokened by the widespread interest in existentialism which we are presently witnessing. In becoming amoral, ethically neutral, and free, we have cut the very roots of our being, lost our deepest sense of selfhood and identity, and with neurotics themselves now find ourselves asking, who am I? What is my deepest destiny? What does living really mean?" And then he quotes Anna Russell in Psychiatric Folk Song. At 3, I had a feeling of ambivalence toward my brothers, and so it follows naturally I poisoned all my lovers. But now I'm happy I have learned the lesson this has taught, that everything I do that's wrong is someone else's fault. See, what he's really saying is so clear. He probably did not want to take it all the way that maybe the biblical writers did. But he's certainly touching on the nerve of the problem, isn't he? If we have no transcendent explanation for this, if we cannot put this as a violation of something vertical, some higher law, we end up losing a definition of who we are in our very essence and our very reason for being. Viktor Frankl, after his second time at Auschwitz, he writes this: "If we present man with a concept of man which is not true, we may well corrupt him when we present him as an automation of reflexes, as a mind machine, as a bundle of instincts, as a pawn of drives and reactions, as a mere product of heredity and environment. We then feed the nihilism to which modern man is in any case prone. I became acquainted with the last stage of corruption in my second concentration camp of Auschwitz. The gas chambers of Auschwitz were the ultimate consequence of the theory that man is nothing more but the product of heredity and environment, or as the Nazis like to say, of blood and soil. I am absolutely convinced," he says here, "that the gas chambers of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek were ultimately prepared not in some ministry or other in Berlin, but rather at the desks and in the lecture halls of nihilistic scientists and philosophers." Now, just in case you think this is an extreme statement from a man enveloped in that kind of hate, I happened to be doing 3 open forums at Oxford University a couple of years ago. The place, as is here tonight, was absolutely packed. Students were running to get a seat. They said largest turnout since the days that Lewis had presented a defense of the Christian faith there, because we are living in times where students are asking these very legitimate questions. And it is interesting, at Oxford, of course, is the renowned and the very powerful mind of Richard Dawkins. Dawkins is one who has actually gone on record as saying that the reason we have religion in our brain is that something has gone wrong with the software of human thought. And what we need is to get this virus out of our brains so that we stop thinking about thoughts of God and anything eternal and transcendent. So he wants to remove any idea of religion from any mind. And then he goes on to say this, which is utterly fascinating: there is really no such thing as good and no such thing as evil. That's what our software is giving to us. All we are doing is dancing to our DNA. It's all DNA. I recall some of the students at the end of one of those lectures coming up and gathering around me, and he said, "I agree with Dawkins. I don't believe there's any such thing as good or bad." So I said to him, I said, "Can I ask you a question?" I said, "If I take a 1-year-old baby on this platform and took a sharp butcher knife and chopped that baby up into pieces, do you think I would have done anything morally wrong, sir?" And he paused as students bated breath listening on. And he looked at me and he said, "You know what, Mr. Zacharias? I would not like what you did, but I would not honestly be able to say to you that you did anything morally wrong." He was dancing to his DNA. That's all he said he was doing. Jesus takes issue with that. He calls it clearly evil and sin. And what he says, in your heart and mind, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, he describes very clearly and calls it an open transgression. You see, Christianity, therefore, is not merely an ethical system. It is not just calling us to a moral life to be better. It is actually identifying the condition that you and I find ourselves in. And the longer I am in this world as a human being, the more I understand what it is Christ actually meant. For you see, I have to be very honest with you. People often say, you know, what's the most difficult thing in the life that you lead? This is not the most difficult thing I do. The most difficult thing I do is attempting to live by the convictions that I preach and stand for. That's the most difficult thing, because temptation stalks at every corner. The lust of the flesh attacks you when you least expect to be tempted. Even though you may be happily married, deeply in love with your family, and deeply committed to them, the heart still struggles on the inside at times. And what it is a revelation of the human condition. And this is what Jesus said right from the beginning. All that is in the flesh, lust of the eyes, lust of life, and the pride of life. But he not only gave us an honest description of the human condition, he also responded with a provision that was distinctive and very unique. There is no other way to describe what it is that the cross actually represents when he talks about providing for my malady, where he mirrors for me what it is on the cross of Christ that actually happened. For you see, he brings together 2 or 3 realities on the cross. The first reality that he brings on the cross is that the hate and the animosity and the venom of people who were willing to put him up there. And it was not one nation, it was not one tribe, it was not one ethnic group. If you and I were there, we would have been part of that mob, because somehow he stood over against all the propensities and the proclivities of the masses at that time. Many who claimed to be very religious people. But as he took himself and gave himself into their hands, as it were, as he was headed for the cross, even the disciples looked at him, and Peter, who is his closest follower, could not believe that this was going to be the end of the road for somebody like him. The cross was so undignified and so humiliating that a Roman citizen could never be crucified. I mentioned to you last night, the very word excruciatus comes from the Latin words as if out of the cross. The Journal of the American Medical Association several years ago did a study on what actually happened to the human body on the cross. 2 medical doctors and 1 scientist wrote that article, and they affirmed the fact that they could not think of a more painful way in which the body could ultimately be exterminated as the weight shifted from one side to the other. And I say to you, it is a graphic picture of what it is that sin had actually done within the human heart, the physical and the emotional agony of it. Donald Gray Barnhouse, the famed preacher from Philadelphia, was known as the great illustrator. He was always able to give his children an illustration for a tough question. When Dr. Barnhouse was widowed early and lost his wife, they were driving to the funeral, actually sometime before that. His little girl came up to him and said, "Daddy, I don't understand it. You told us that Jesus Christ died for our sins. If Jesus died for our sins, why did Mommy still have to die?" And of course, the great illustrator knew from the mouth of babes, you'll sometimes be asked the most profound questions. He didn't know how to satisfactorily answer her. On the day of the funeral, as they were driving on that bright sunny day, sitting next to her, the dad put his arm around her and he said, "You see that truck in front of us, sweetheart, by that traffic light?" And she said, "Yes." Said, "Do you see the shadow of that truck that is on the sidewalk?" And she said, "Yes." He said, "If you had to be run over, would you rather be run over by the truck or by the shadow on the sidewalk?" And she somehow managed a little smile and she said, "Daddy, you know the answer to that. If the shadow went over me, it wouldn't hurt as much. I'd rather be run over by the shadow than by the truck itself." And he said, "That's what Jesus has done for you and for me, sweetie. He said, the truck of God's judgment has gone over him. It's only the shadow of death that goes over you and me now, as he takes the penalty and takes the punishment to pronounce forgiveness for you and me. It was no one less than Oscar Wilde, who lay in his bed dying in his 40s, who said the only hope he could ever find to understand his agony was in the person of Christ. And some of the most profound words on the cross are written by Wilde, a renowned hedonist who understood what pain and suffering must have meant for Christ himself. Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi, two noted heroes of the decades gone by, both of them testified in their writings that the cross stood as a supreme example to them, unmatched anywhere else. That provision is made for you, and that provision is made for me. For when I come to that cross, it is the counter perspective of everything in this world. Listen to me. It is the counter perspective of everything in this world. The world calls upon you and me to somehow find a way of self-aggrandizement, power. But it's okay. This was an important book to write.
You wrote on suffering, which you've touched before in other books. Why did you go back to this topic?
I think it's not only a good question, it was a question that I had to wrestle with myself quite a bit. I've written on this subject in chapter form. For example, in The Cries of the Heart, the cry for hope and suffering or something like that. Then I did this also in the questions that Jesus answered in Jesus Among Other Gods, how he dealt with the issue of was this man born blind because of his sin or his parents' sin? What's the reason for this man being born blind? So I approached it in a chapter form. Then I've done it in the book of Job in my speaking. But the collaboration here of working with Vince Vitale was the particular attraction. Vince, of course, our colleague at Oxford, a tutor at Oxford University, did his graduate work at Princeton and then his doctoral level work at Oxford. And in his doctoral level work, this was the question he addressed, Bob, the whole issue of pain and suffering. And he took some interesting angles into it so that even the Oxford supervisors for his dissertation were very commending of his insights into it. I dealt with it from about 3 or 4 questions point of view. He dealt with 3 or 4 questions. And I think the composite is something very telling. People who've read it, some tremendous endorsements, people like Tim Keller, Os Guinness, and others who've said very unique approach in answering this question of why suffering.
How did you become unique on such an ancient question? I mean, people have been talking about suffering since man has been on this planet. So how do you approach it in a new way?
Yeah, I think that's the challenge. Is there anything new that's going to be added to the corpus of material already there? The way we've broken it down, Bob, I've done the philosophical side of it. How do we answer the naturalist or the skeptic? So let me present the question the way the naturalist does. He presents it as a trilemma. What is the trilemma? God is all-powerful. God is all-loving. But evil exists. Pain and suffering exists. So there are 3 prongs to the question. If God is all-powerful and if God is all-loving, why do we experience suffering? They present it as a trilemma. So as I begin to approach it, I say to myself and to the reader, wait a minute. Is that the comprehensive way of looking at the question? Why is it a trilemma? Why is it not a quadrilemma? Why have we not introduced that God is also all-knowing? Or a quintilemma, that eternity still awaits in the whole process of explanation? Why did we just take 3 of these in order to present the problem? Can we not take God is all-wise and make the quadrilemma then, and then God is eternal and present the quintilemma? So I've dealt with the question from these multiple prongs. That's the first thing. Second thing, when the atheist or the naturalist raises the question that there's too much of evil, suffering, and pain in the world, therefore there cannot be a God, What about the naturalist's explanation of this? How do they explain this? What about the Muslim? How does he or she, as a Muslim, devout Muslim, explain it? What about the pantheist? What about the Buddhist? All of these worldviews have to give an answer to the problem of evil, pain, and suffering, not just the Christian. So my challenge was, in the writing of this book, to take a look at how these worldviews approach it and show how the Christian view, Judeo-Christian view, is actually the most coherent and most comprehensive answer that there is. Then Vince approaches it from other aspects. So we try to come to it from new angles of approach, contrasting answers. That's at least one aspect of the uniqueness here.
So we go right to the big question. Why do we suffer?
I link in 5 or 6 steps and break them down. First of all, we all know that love is the supreme ethic. Everyone grants that. If you were to talk to a naturalist, he or she will say, yeah, love is that supreme ethic. Whenever they raise the question, for example, can you ever justify torturing a baby for your own just delight and your thrill? No, because the baby is vulnerable, the baby is weak, the baby is innocent of why all of this is happening. So love is seen as the supreme ethic. But where there is love, there has to be freedom. If you don't have freedom, you cannot really love, because love also has to have the choice of not loving. Where there is love, there has to be freedom. Where there is freedom, there will always be the possibility of evil. Where there is the possibility of evil, there will be the need for a Savior. Where there is the need for a Savior, we must see the prospect of redemption. So if love is the supreme ethic, freedom follows as a necessity, then you have the possibility of evil, which need provides the need for a Savior, and ultimately redemption. These 5 aspects I pull together in trying to explain them, and then see whether or not it makes sense how we conquer not in spite of the mystery of suffering, but how we conquer through it.
Do we need to suffer to be complete Christians?
I think it is a question worth pondering and thinking about it by analogy. I remember I was writing one of these chapters in Jakarta, Indonesia, and I was having lunch with the pastor of one of the largest churches there. And as Stephen Tong and I were talking, he's a man in his late 70s, I think, and we're having a simple meal, a bowl of rice and some boiled chicken, and here's a pastor of a huge church. We were having this simple meal. And so he said, what are you writing about? So I said, writing on suffering. And he's spooning the rice into his mouth, and then, a grain of rice on the corner of his mouth and so on. And he says, it's necessary. He said, suffering is necessary. So I started smiling. I said, why do you even say that? He said, I was raised as one of, 7 children or what. His mother was a single mother, was widowed early, and raised the 7 of them. He talked about the suffering through which his family had been. Obviously, Bob, when we look from the other side of this tunnel and look in retrospect at suffering, Malcolm Muggeridge said it, some of the great saints have said it, we don't like it, but it produces the character and the hope, and obviously in eternity we'll have an explanation. One more point. The captain of our salvation, made perfect, made complete through suffering. If our Lord himself had to go through that as he endured the cross, despising the shame, and is now set down at the right hand of God, that's why I think there is a key word that James Stewart uses, which I expand upon here. He conquered not in spite of the dark mystery of evil, he conquered through it. And I believe it is the same in your life and mine. We may not like it, but we conquer through the pain and through the suffering. And when someone says, if you ask me to erase the last 2 years of my pain and suffering, I wouldn't want to do it. We'd better listen to the wisdom that comes from that kind of a person.
Is there a sense that we get to know Christ, get to know our Lord in a unique way through suffering that no other experience can bring us? I think of Job and his words in the book where he says, I had heard of you, but now my eye sees you.
And I think this is it. when the Apostle Paul talks about being conformed to the image of Christ, and he talks about not only the resurrection, but the suffering of the cross. And he says that I may know him, the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his suffering, being made conformable unto his death. Now, Saul of Tarsus to Paul came to know Christ in a chronologically different way to any of the other early writers. All of them knew Jesus from his birth, life, death, and resurrection. The Apostle Paul encountered him as the risen Christ first and took that regressive journey back. So he said, I need to know the cross and understand this better. And that's why he said, henceforth let no man trouble me. I bear on my body the marks of the Lord. I think the suffering aspect of our Lord and the suffering of the early church and the suffering of Job, all are indicators in the same way. Again, I repeat, none of us wants it. In a small way, I've suffered so much now for 29 years with my back issues, the pain and all. But every time I stand up with a prayer, because I know, but for the strength of God, I don't think I'm going to make it through another sermon. Every time I get onto a plane, I know I'm going to be sitting there for hours. How am I going to make it? Will I do all right? This limitation enables me to see and understand the provision of Christ more and more, that every breath that we draw is given by him. When we are young, we sort of mount up with wings as eagles, Then we get stronger and we run and we don't want to get weary. But then we are in our veteran years, we want to walk and not faint. So the early days of mounting up with wings as eagles, we soar high. We don't think of the waning strength. But as the strength wanes, we begin to realize how much God was needed every step of the way.
Let me take that a step further. Would you say that suffering is necessary to Christians?
I think so. I think so. For several reasons. I think the fine-tuning of one's own life. You don't just, ride the crest of success all the time. People who have never been broken will never really recognize their own limitation and their own finitude. And number two, in a world of so much pain, so much suffering, so much hurt, in love's service, the wounded soldier served the best, said Thornton Wilder. I think suffering is necessary. In fact, if someone has never suffered, I would actually consider them an incomplete person.
What's difficult, I guess, is talking to those who are in the midst of suffering, right, to get them to understand you got to get to this point. How do you do that?
Well, it's the old adage. You're either coming out of one or you're about to go into one, or you have just talked to somebody who's gone through one. You pretty much have to realize, I look at it this way. The first sound of a baby is a cry. The baby is totally confused. I don't know what's happening. We've all been through that, but we don't remember a moment of it. But there's obviously the muscle involvement. There's the stranger involvement. There's a inability to explain the context involvement. The smiles come after relationships have been built and understanding has been procured. The crying comes, the smiles come after all of that. The crying comes immediately, impulsively. So I just think we have to talk to somebody going through it right now in this way and say to them, look, no trial for the moment seems joyous. Rather, says the Bible, it is grievous, but afterwards it shall yield the peaceable fruit of righteousness. Vince Vitale takes a different approach on this, and I think it's quite brilliant. He says, look, if you want to be somehow deprived of what it is you've endured in pain and all that taken away from you, you will not be the same person. You are who you are by the marks that you actually bear and the scars that you actually carry. It's the imprint of God on your individual soul. If you want to be rid of everything that has hurt and all the painful things you've endured, you're really asking to be somebody other than who you are right now. And that's an important question. Do I want to be somebody else? The answer is no. Why is it exciting to be who I am? The answer is no. It is who God designed me to be. You take the load and the responsibility for which God has called you. You are loved for who you are individually and distinctively. You become the person that God shaped you to be. Do I want any different children to the ones I have? No. Do I want to be married to a different person than I am? No. You are in this mold that God has positioned you. Now, somebody may turn around and say, I would sure like to have a different relationship. I've gone through a lot of struggle and tiring and so on. You never know what you're comparing it to, though. What is the option you're talking about? Maybe what you need to see is, if God has given me this life, and God has given me these relationships, and God has given me the privilege of being where I am, what is the best way for me to be a steward of what I now have? To talk about an alternative is to talk about it in a vacuum. Sometimes people who have everything going for them are just as sorrowful and wished they had a different lot in life. I've come to the conclusion, God raised me in India. Born in the city of Chennai in the south, raised in the city of Delhi. So I understand a little bit of the southern language in Tamil. I speak a lot of Hindi. I was one of 5. I was the least productive of the 5. The one least expected to succeed of the 5. Then I moved to Canada. I walk into a church as a total stranger. And the first time in weeks when I walk into church, because I was working Sundays after that, I meet the young gal who is ultimately going to become my wife. And God then moved me through different trajectories, through Vietnam, through Cambodia, all of those settings, and then married in 72. Now, all these years later, raising 3 lovely kids and then the grandchildren on the way and so on. Would I really want to be anybody else? The answer is no. Only God could have designed what he wanted to accomplish in my life. And I bow my head and I say, you're a sovereign God. We need to learn to recognize he has a particular purpose for us. And if it has not been a joyride, it has still been a purposeful one.
We've talked about the positive side of suffering, if we can. Where does evil and sin fall into this equation?
And they are interconnected. When choices that are made in violation of purpose, that's what evil is. Violation of purpose is evil. A car is designed to be driven for transportation. If I use it as a weapon to run over people, I've violated purpose. I am designed to reflect the image of God. Can I violate that purpose? When I violate that purpose, it is evil. When evil is espoused, suffering entails. The purpose of this hand is to grab and to hold things and to write and all of that. If I decide to use this hand as a fist to pummel somebody and hurt somebody purposefully, I've inflicted pain. But along with that pain comes a suffering in a cosmic sense and in a solidarity sense for all of us. So when I say no to God, I'm committing sin. And when I commit sin, evil and pain come because the relationship is severed. So evil is the root of it. Suffering is the symptom of it. And let me put it this way. Psychiatrists are debating the use of a drug and they're struggling with it. It is this. They think they can find something that can deal with post-traumatic stress disorder. Those who've come back from war, memories, nightmares and all. By the swallowing of that pill, it can mitigate some of that. But the psychiatrists are struggling with the question. If I can use this to erase memories that I don't want to remember, what about if the rapist goes and commits a horrendous rape one night, comes back at the end of it, pops this pill, and he wakes up in the morning and he's okay, no remorse? Is that the world we really want? So remorse, guilt, pain, suffering are symptomatic expressions to remind us what evil is all about. That's what C.S. Lewis says in one of his books. He says, shame is like a drink. He said, it can scald you if you deal with it in any other way than the right way. And so I believe shame is a reminder to us that what we have done in violation of God's order is wrong, and the pain and all that ensues is the symptom of it.
I'm sure a lot of Christians are listening now, non-Christians who are going through difficult times. How do they determine which part of this equation am I responsible for?
Yeah, I think that question of personal guilt is a difficult one. And sometimes we always jump to that. If something goes wrong in the family, what have I done? What have I done to deserve? That was Job's question. Did I do anything? I've tried to live my life. We always think of immediate cause and effect. And Jesus put that to rest in the story of the man who was born blind. When John 8 is it, John 8 or 9 or something, he talks about, when the disciples ask him, and he says, look, it's not him or his parents. This was done that the work of God might be displayed in his life. God is at work, and God is having a purpose for us. I have always been immensely blessed by Annie Johnston Flint's writings. When you look at Annie Johnston Flint's life, orphaned early, became arthritic, rheumatoid arthritis, twisted up in bed, incontinent, cancerous, blind. And her book is called The Making of the Beautiful, or something like that, by Roland Bingham. And she wrote so many hymns. One of them was, He giveth more grace when the burdens grow greater. He sendeth more strength when the labors increase. To added affliction he addeth his mercy. To multiplied trials his multiplied peace. When we have exhausted our store of endurance, when our strength has failed ere the day is half done, when we reach the end of our hoarded resources, our Father's full giving has only begun. His love has no limit, his grace has no measure, his power has no boundaries known unto men. For out of his infinite riches in Jesus he giveth and giveth and giveth again. This book, if I were to put it in a nutshell, would be, how do we get to that place? You see, there's a philosophical side to the question, Bob, and that's all we often labor on. But there's a pastoral side to the question. How do we find comfort when we're in the thick of it? We must remember that. There's a philosophical side to it. There's a pastoral side to it. When I'm suffering and I'm in pain, I may not need only philosophical answers. I may need somebody to cradle me and somebody to carry me through. When a child goes in to get an injection, there's no way to explain to the child why this is all about, The child probably thinks, why has my mother even brought me here to jab this thing into my side? And then when the child gets older, they find out it was for a purpose, it was for a design, it was to keep them from even greater hurt and pain down the road.
You mentioned in the book that you and Vince have some resources available for those that are going through suffering. What are they?
Well, there are so many books written on the subject. I know Tim Keller's recent one is a fantastic book too. And then the classic, of course, from the existential viewpoint would be C.S. Lewis's Problem of Pain. John Feinberg has written on a journey in suffering, and his book is actually found in a book edited by Morgan and Peterson, I think. They can find that. It's called Suffering and the Goodness of God. If they look at that book edited by the two authors, Feinberg's article, a chapter is in there, and I think he's written separately on that too. The book gives a whole lot of, our book gives a whole lot of names in the background and also in the footnotes that they can consult. But John Feinberg's journey was actually one of the most remarkable things I'd ever read. And I did not know a lot of this because he'd been my professor in the 70s at Trinity. And his master's work was on the problem of suffering and pain. His PhD was on the problem of suffering and pain. And then in his chapter on A Journey in Suffering, he talks about how one day it was diagnosed what malady his wife was carrying in her body. It's quite a description. It slowly debilitates the body and then lives with an awful lot of pain. And the tragedy of it is that it is transferred into the next generation as well. And so he thought, is this what my children are now going to face? Because I think her mother had also had the same struggle. And he said, it was the hardest day of my life to come back home and realize that I was looking at my kids and seeing what my wife was going through, that this lay ahead for them as well. But the pastoral side of it and how he coped with it, and that's why he focuses. He's a philosopher. He's a highly trained philosopher, but he focuses on the pastoral side of finding comfort. So John Feinberg's writings, C.S. Lewis's writings, Tim Keller, and so many others have written on the subject. We give a list of some of these books at the back of our own, and people can purchase them, reflect on them, or just read chapters from them. I think they'll find a confluence of thought that can carry somebody through. As C. Os Guinness put it very well, there's no one-size-fits-all response to these things. And so when you read in a diversity of areas and responses, you find exactly what God has to say to minister to you.
Final question. Do you think Christians in many cases dismiss suffering when they're dealing with other people and don't always quite empathize to the degree that they should?
Yes, it's easy to do. And, when we look at people who've gone through much, you say, how do I step into this person's shoes? I was in faraway land recently, and a man from a very prominent law firm came to see me. And he sat down, highly successful man, highly successful monetarily and professionally. He sat in my hotel room, and the reason I even left the cafeteria, because I knew it was a difficult conversation, I said, look, let's go into my room and talk. This is going to be very painful for you. His daughter in her 20s steps out of her room and jumps off the 30th floor of this apartment building. Okay? And now the dad is looking at me, and he said, how do I ever bring closure to anything like this in my life? This will haunt me all my life. He said, my daughter, 26 or something like that, I go into the room and find out she's not there and see the balcony door open, and I look out. And there she is. How do you cope with something like that? So the question of pain, and I say to her, can I say to him, I know what you're going through? No. You have to, at that point, give him some. I told him the story of my own suicide and told him the story of others and how closure ultimately came. And so he wrote to me, he said, I appreciate what you're saying, that time is not a healer, time is a revealer of how God does the healing. He said, please pray for me. I will someday bring closure to this, I hope. He said, just listening to you brought me such comfort and hope that these things are possible. I gave him an illustration. I said, why are you here to talk to me? He said, after this happened, I lost all faith in God. He said, and the preacher was giving an invitation to the church one day. I was angry with him. I said, nonsense. He said, I stepped out of the church. And as I walk across the road, I'm standing in front of a bookstore, and he said, I'm looking at your book, Has Christianity Failed You? on the just inside the window. And I said to myself, it sure has. He said, I went in and bought the book. And he said, I opened the book, and on the front page it says, dedicated to Mark Poo. He said, Mark Poo is one of my clients, and he's a friend of yours. I phoned Mark. I said, who is this guy who's written this book? I need to see him. I said, you see, my friend, can you not see the Grand Weaver has a pattern even in something like this for us to meet? And he started nodding his head. He said, I've never had he said, I've known of you. He said, I had no idea you knew my friend Mark Poo, and that's how the connection came. God brings little links together. That which is Caesar's, and give to God that which is God's. The man ought to have had a follow-up question, and he ought to have said, what belongs to God? Jesus' answer would have been, whose image is on you? I want you to understand something here. No other founder of a worldview would have positioned you in that description. The Imago Dei, the image of God. What this questioner was trying to do was pit him in a political battle with the powers that be. But then the second questioner comes and wants to pit him law against law, ethic against ethic. And they said to him, which is the greatest commandment? What he said was this: you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind and all your strength. and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. He said, on these two laws hang all of the laws and the prophets. Why did he not give one? Because hinged on the one was the inextricable imperative of the second. Those two answers of Jesus lead me into the conclusions that I want to draw. The first is this, that he gave us the source and necessity of moral reasoning.
And now here's Ravi Zacharias with the second part of his message, Jesus Among Other Gods.
How do you come to moral reasoning if all that is the original source is nothing more than time plus matter plus chance and purely materialistic and chemical in its source? How does one arrive at moral reasoning? And yet we struggle with it, don't we? Professor Kai Nielsen from Calgary. We have not been able to show that reason requires a moral point of view at all, or that really rational persons unhoodwinked by myth or ideology need not be individual egoists or classical amoralists. Reason doesn't decide here. The picture I've painted for you is not a pleasant one. Reflection on this depresses me. Pure, practical reason, even with a good knowledge of the facts, will not take you to morality. Richard Rorty, who had no ultimate criticism to offer even above the Holocaust, says this: if moral imperatives are not commanded by God's will, and if they are not in some sense absolute, then what ought to be is a matter simply of what men and women decide should be. There is no other source of judgment. Bertrand Russell affirmed that. J.L. Mackie affirms that, contrary to Sam Harris's latest book on ethics, which is really rehashing nothing else but a kind of materialistic theory of the human well-being. There is no ontic referent for an absolute moral law. Let me tell you why this becomes so critical. I think this becomes critical because I want you to follow me now. When the problem of evil is raised, which, by the way, is one of the main reasons most atheists say they became atheists in their journey in search. Bart Ehrman is a primary example of that, the scholar on biblical documents and so on, that the problem of evil sort of was the death knell for his belief. But I want you to think of it this way. When you say there's evil, don't you assume there's such a thing as good? When you say there's such a thing as good, aren't you assuming a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil? When you assume there's such a thing as a moral law, must you not posit a moral lawgiver? But that's whom one is trying to disprove and not prove. Because if there's no moral lawgiver, there's no moral law. If there's no moral law, there's no good. If there's no good, there's no evil. What becomes of the question? I remember a student at Nottingham standing up and saying to me, "What then am I asking you?" Because he posited the reality of evil. Now, you can question that step-by-step argument I've just taken. And at one step you may say, wait a minute, Ravi, all right, I will assume there is such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil. Why do you have to posit a moral lawgiver in order to sustain that? Here's my response to you, and I want you to earnestly think about it. Don't fight me on it. Think about it. When the question is raised on evil, it is either raised by a person or about persons. Whenever the problem of evil is raised, it is either raised by a person or about persons, which means the intrinsic worth of personhood is assumed in the question. Can one really make that assumption within a totally naturalistic framework? Isn't it not contrived and extraneous then, the value? I think what Jesus says here is remarkable. The value given to you is intrinsic. It's not extrinsic. That every human life is a life of worth and a life of value. That is the bequest of the Judeo-Christian teaching. That your life has intrinsic worth and is inviolable. And so I say to you, the struggle to find out what happens with life in its value and the positing of the question of evil, philosophers say to you they have not been able to come up with an argument or an ontic referent for this. And it is this that prompted Nietzsche to say, the real truth about objective truth is that the latter is a fiction. Equality is a lie concocted by inferior people. Did you hear that? Nietzsche, who coined the phrase, God is dead. Equality is a lie concocted by inferior people who arrange themselves in herds to overpower those who are naturally superior to them. The morality of equal rights is a herd morality. And because it opposes the cultivation of superior individuals, it leads to the corruption of the human species. Truth ends up becoming the name we give to that which agrees with our instinctive preferences. It is what we call our own interpretation of the world, especially when we want to foist it upon others. Truth, he says, is like in a hall of mirrors, self-reflecting, self-referential. But then he says this incredible thing, however, I'm still too pious that even I worship at the altar where God's name is truth. Let me ask you this. Is equality a herd mentality? Or do I have a responsibility to every human being, whatever their education, whatever their background, whatever their level of understanding, to treat them with equal dignity when I meet them? I see in the teaching of Christ an incredible leveler of that which you and I assume. And so I see that in his teaching and his two answers, I deduce three things. Number one, intrinsic value to every human life. Number two, a political distance so that he never ever sought the power to impose his view against the will of a person. I hope you heard that. He did not seek to impose his message against the will of a person. Isn't it interesting that in a country like this, you and I can come and discuss things so openly with fear of impunity or the fear and the threat of my life being threatened or your life being threatened? I have been to places in the world where they've wanted to position me behind bulletproof glass to defend my Christian faith. Some places of the world, well, I'll get a telephone call. Somebody wanting to finish me off because of my belief in the Christian faith. Why is it in the West we have this freedom? Because I have no right to politically impose my belief on you. I should have the right to present it to you and to bring it into the marketplace of ideas and trust you with your judgment to receive it. But the enforcement of it in many other worldviews is the distinction that is there from the Christian faith. Better value it. Better value it. I find it fascinating that when seminaries were evangelical, the liberal counter-perspectives were given free course to teach. When they went to an extreme form of a kind of liberal and critical methodology, the evangelical was sort of marginalized in the process and not given a fair representation of his or her view. Not everywhere, but it happened. So the first thing I say to you is intrinsic worth. Secondly, the political distance. And thirdly, that emerges from that is something very fascinating. It is this. Jesus always reached out to the marginalized over society rather than the sophisticated ones, be they religious or powerful. When he stopped to talk to the woman at the well who had 5 broken marriages in her life, the disciples questioned why he would even want to be seen by a woman like that. When the woman with the alabaster ointment came and poured it over him, she was a woman who'd made her money through means that would never have been affirmed or supported by the mainstream of society there. And the Pharisee looked at her and he thought to himself, if he only knew who she was, he would never have allowed her to even come near him. Children came to talk to him. The poor and the leprous came for his touch. The imperative of love and compassion from Christ to the marginalized in society came as a natural outworking of these two precepts, that every human being is made in the image of God, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. This leads me to the next major thought. First, he gave me a framework for moral reasoning. The second thing he gave me is not only the perspective to look outwards, but to look inwards. This is the most discomforting thing in Western thinking today. What is that discomforting thing? Nobody ever likes to use the word sin. And as soon as some radio broadcaster or some interviewer on television has got you to use that word, he triumphantly thinks he's now got you in a corner. Malcolm Muggeridge said this: the depravity of man is at once the most empirically verifiable fact, even at the same time as it is the most intellectually resisted. The depravity of man is at once the most empirically verifiable fact at the same time that it is the most intellectually resisted. Take a look at the 20th century, when we were touting all these communication skills and everything, when we killed more people in the 20th century, more than the previous 19 put together. What is it about the human heart? Here's where I want to anchor it for you. Jesus never said your problem and mine is a moral problem. He gave us the parameters for moral reasoning, but he said at the root of it is a spiritual problem. Not merely the rejection of the laws of God, but the inability to even rise up to that which would have been the standard of communion with God. When the crunch comes and the pressure comes, all of us are capable of the most heinous things. I never celebrate with some kind of, I'm not one of those when a minister stumbles and falls, because I know how easy it is living with a heart like this. I've spent more than half of my life on the road. I know the temptations out there. I know the seductions out there. But I also know I have a commitment to my family to be honorable in all that I say. Why then the temptation? Because the heart is desperately wicked and will rationalize itself into justifying anything. Tell me, how do two men break into a home and rape a woman and two young girls and walk away, setting the house ablaze, too close to home? How does that happen? The human heart is capable of the most extreme things when it is untamed and ungoverned. And the problem is not merely moral. The problem is spiritual. This is the unique, distinctive teaching of Christ, that your heart and mine is actually capable of limitless thoughts and acts. And the Bible calls it sin, meaning very simply, it's the violation of purpose, the violation of God's purpose for your life and mine. In its simplest form. And I say to you, he describes for me my moral framework, but beyond that, he also talks about my spiritual condition. Many of you may not know this, but I became a Christian at the age of 17 when I'd attempted to take my own life. I'd seen so much in my young life that I could not explain, and the only escape for me was to snuff it out. But when I got a look at my own heart and looked at what it was that was the remedy, which is my third major point here, Christ doesn't only give you a moral framework. He doesn't only anchor it in something that's spiritually deviant within you and me. He provides for you the malady, the cure for your malady, and the answer to it. And the answer is not in education or not merely in upbringing. The answer is in a radically new way of thinking and a changed heart, a heart that only God is big enough to alter and bring the change within you and me. That's the Christian message, that no amount of moral reasoning is going to change this world. I remember in the 1970s, Ted Turner talking about the fact that with the presence of media and television and all of this, we were going to have a brand new world out there. Brand new world with communication. I have been crisscrossing this globe now for over 30 years. I have never seen more obvious hate and intolerance and impatience and uncertainty. I'll be in audiences where anger erupts from somebody who's determined to wreak havoc globally. And I stand back and I say, can we really change this? Jesus' answer may sound very simple, but it's the most profound thing that I want to share with you. In the gospel, the centerpiece is the cross of Christ. And the reason the centerpiece of the gospel is the cross is because of two things that you and I need. Number one is forgiveness. And number two, in learning to be forgiven, also learning to forgive. The cross shows you four confluent ideas. Let me give this to you. I was asked to speak at the United Nations Prayer Breakfast a few years ago. And they wanted me to speak on a search for absolutes in a relativistic world. And it's a tough subject in about 20 minutes, 25, and even tougher early in the morning. And you have to be careful because there are many different religions represented. You just can't come in and in-your-face talk. So you take about 3/4 of it building your case, and the last 3-4 minutes telling them what you believe the answer is. So I said, what absolutes are you looking for here? You're looking for justice, aren't you? You're always talking about justice globally. I said, what else are you looking for? To define real evil. We call each other evil empires when we stand on the podium out here. Your evil says one, your evil says the other. We talk about evil. We talk about justice. I said, and some of you have come as very lonely men and women here. You're missing your families because you know what is most important in your life is this thing called love. And they all nodded, just sitting there perched, listening. I said, I tell you what, some of you are going to blow it big time. And then you'll come to your colleagues to ask for forgiveness. Justice, evil, love, and forgiveness. I said, you're looking for absolutes in this. They were nodding. I said, can I point out to you the one place in the world where these four converged? On a hill called Calvary, on the cross of Christ. I want to tell you the truth, ladies and gentlemen. When I finished talking, they were lined up towards the end of the door, one by one wanting to come and talk. And a man from an atheistic country grabbed my hand and he said, Dr. Zacharias, I came here as an atheist. And I'm very unhappy out here. My country sent me here. He said, I've often wondered why I came here. He said, today, I think I have finally understood in what you explained about the cross and its offer to me. Do you know what's been going on globally for 5,000 years? The logic of unforgiveness. What if one were to take the logic of forgiveness and deal with it in a way that is willing to give up much else in order to love your fellow human being greater than you love just a portion of real estate? I say to you this, that in identifying the moral framework, pointing out to the cross, he turns to you and me and says, the problem being spiritual, the solution is for you to understand that you need a change of heart, and only God is big enough to do that. It moves me to two final thoughts that I shall keep brief. Jesus' embodiment of the ideal, the purity of Christ. He said to his tormentors, which of you convinces me of sin? When you look at this, the Hebrews had the ideal in light. The Greeks had the ideal in knowledge. The Romans had the ideal in glory. All abstractions, light, knowledge, glory. The Apostle Paul was a Hebrew by birth, a citizen of Rome, studied at a Greek university. And he's speaking to this pluralistic society of his, says this: God, who caused the light to shine out of darkness, has caused his light to shine in our hearts, to give to us the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ Jesus our Lord. So said Paul. He took the abstractions and pointed to the embodiment, the purity of a life so beautifully lived. When I was writing my book on an imaginary conversation between Jesus and Gautama Buddha, the book called The Lotus and the Cross, Jesus talks to Buddha. I remember going to Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and being in a Buddhist monastery there, chatting with the monks and so on. And I remember one day closing my book, ending it all, and asking one of them, which is the quintessential life that you think has been lived out the way a life ought to have been lived? The man looked at me and said, I would have to point to Jesus Christ. Mahatma Gandhi carried a New Testament with him all his life. He had memorized much of the Sermon on the Mount. And Gandhi said this: I like their Christ, I don't like their Christian. What he'd seen in Christ was such a powerful instruction to him of the way life ought to be ultimately lived. Whatever you have against the church may be very legitimate, but I'd ask you to think, what is it you have against Christ? What is it you've seen in him that says to you, that's not right? And it moves me to my final thought, the hope he gives from beyond the grave and the resurrection. One of the most difficult things I had to do in Vietnam was to be at funerals when somebody's friend had passed away. And I remember standing around some of them, people I didn't even know, and his fellow soldiers kneeling by the grave and so on. So tough as a young man in my mid-20s, watching that happen, where some of them didn't even know why they were there, didn't even know what they were doing, and watching their buddies killed. And one of them wrote this poem in a very dire situation. Lord God, I have never spoken to you, but now I want to say, how do you do? You see, God, they told me you didn't exist, and like a fool I believed all this. Last night from a shell hole I saw your sky. I figured right then they had told me a lie. Had I taken time to see the things you made, I'd have known they weren't calling a spade a spade. I wonder, God, if you'll take my hand. Somehow I feel that you'll understand. Funny I had to come to this hellish place before I had time to see your face. Well, I guess there isn't much more to say, but I'm sure glad, God, I met you today. I guess 0 hour will soon be here, but I'm not afraid since I know you're near. The signal, well, God, I'll have to go. I like you lots, I want you to know. Look now, this will be a horrible fight. Who knows, I may come to your house tonight. Though I wasn't friendly to you before, I wonder, God, if you'd wait at your door. Look, I'm crying, I'm shedding tears. I'll have to go now, God. Goodbye. Strange now since I met you. I'm not afraid to die. The hope that Christ gives. I want to close with this and then throw it open for questions. You see, if what I'm telling you is true,